Space, the final frontier. The United States wants to patrol it. Washington has announced the creation of a new armed space force by 2020. But who will be the U.S. competing against? And is this the start of a new space race? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Yahawah Abdelhamid. U.S. Vice President Mike Pence says the time has come to prepare for the next battlefield. And that battlefield is space. The Americans want to create a space force within 2 years to defend U.S. satellites and spacecraft from attack. It will be the first new branch of the military since 1947. Pence's boss, Donald Trump, wants Congress to vote yes to the plan and agree to additional funding of $8 billion. We will get to our guest shortly, but first, Alan Fisher reports from Washington, D.C.
Donald Trump has been pushing for the creation of a new branch of the military for months. He talks about it often at his rallies.
We may even have a space force.
Now his vice president says Donald Trump's vision will become a reality.
While too often, previous administrations all but neglected the growing security threats emerging in space, President Trump stated clearly and forcefully that space is, in his words, a war-fighting domain just like land and air and sea.
The new force will be used to protect US satellites in space, which provide vital services like communication. It can also protect spy satellites, which direct military operations. And there is the growing commercial space market too. It's not a new idea. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan called for a space-based missile defense system just a year after Congress demanded the establishment of a new space force. The defense system, dubbed Star Wars by critics, never got beyond the research phase. The US already has a Space Command. It's part of the Air Force, and some see the new branch as an expensive waste. In fact, Defence Secretary Jim Mattis initially resisted it, but just earlier this week signalled he was now on board.
We are in complete alignment with the President's concern about protecting our assets in space that contribute to our security, to our economy, and we're going to have to address it as other countries show a capability to attack those assets.
Creating a new branch of the military needs congressional authorization and funding. If Republicans lose control of the House of Representatives in November's midterm elections, it might never happen. Former astronaut Mark Kelly says he doesn't see the point.
There is a threat out there, but it's being handled by the U.S. Air Force today. Doesn't make sense to build a whole nother level of bureaucracy.
The Space Force, if approved, would become the sixth branch of the U.S. military. It would be led by a four-star officer and would pull resources from other military branches. Russia has a Space Force. China's space program is run by the military. And the White House will include an $8 billion funding request for their new Space Force in the next budget. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Let's now get the thoughts of our guests. Joining us in Lubbock, Texas via Skype, Oliver McGee, an advisor to Donald Trump and former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary for Transportation. In Beijing, Einar Tangen, a China political analyst. And in Sydney, Maurice Jones, a space analyst and author of When Men Walked on the Moon. A warm welcome to all of you. Oliver McGee, let me start with you. I mean, it does sound like something out of a Star Wars. So what exactly is a Space Force, and in what is it different from the current Space Command?
Well, this isn't time for us to move from Reagan Star Wars, which was really about ending the Cold War, to Trump's Space Force, which is about ensuring global peace, world peace. The Space Force is really, like you said in your opening segment, the sixth military agency, and it's very important for securing space. It's about navigation, reconnaissance, and communications. And this is all about trying to make sure that we don't have Pearl Harbors in space, where we would have a blackout and that would basically cripple the global economy. This is really about ensuring the security of global capital and global businesses, which are increasingly dependent upon satellite technologies and space assets. And so Mattis is looking at trying to create a space command similar to what you see in the European Command, the Middle East Command, the African Command, the Pacific Command, and then making sure that space assets are protected and that we have national security of space. Because in the 20th century, we're really talking about the Air Force, and we're trying to essentially secure the stratosphere, which is about 10 to 30 kilometers. And now we're based in the sky, but now we're trying to basically go beyond that and then to move into, that's 10 to 30,000 kilometers, that is. And now we're trying to move into space so where we can basically assure those assets are in place and that we can make sure that we can control space. And this is really more than just Star Wars. It's really about, you might say, Starfleet. And so we were really trying to make sure that we have the president's vision intact. And Pence is trying to establish the Department of Space Force and working closely with the Space Command to ensure that we start advancing space science and technology, which is always a very, very good thing for the United States to get into, because this is really all about ensuring fast capital, fast technology for fast growth.
Well, Morris Jones, I mean, it sounds a bit like militarization of space, which is quite a frightening thought. And it also begs the question, how do you share space? Who decides which country controls what?
Well, I think that you can have a stronger military presence in space and still be able to share space with other nations. The United States and most nations on Earth are bound by the 1967 Outer Space Treaty signed at the United Nations. And basically that says that no nation owns space. No nation claims exclusive access to space. And so even if we see a greater military presence, it won't mean that the United States or any other nation totally controls or dominates space. It's legally prohibited, and it's also physically impossible, in the sense that you cannot stop satellites from orbiting the Earth. You cannot control the physical movements of objects through space in the same way that you can patrol a nation's airspace. And that this has been widely recognized and one of the reasons why we have the Outer Space Treaty. So I don't think that it's a case of any nation dominating space, even if they're protecting their space assets.
Okay, well, that said, I mean, the United States says it has a lot of concerns. Some of them is China, for example, destroyed one of its own satellites in orbit in 2007 and is likely capable of getting rid of others too. Russia is believed to be developing an airborne laser that would be able to destroy space-based systems, and North Korea is believed to have used its GPS jamming capabilities against South Korea in 2010. Now, Einar Tangen, that's where you come into the conversation. How was this announcement of a space force been received in Beijing?
Well, it's not been received very well. It becomes another area of competition besides the economic and political and military on the ground. This is now an attempt to take it into space. I'm surprised that my fellow guests have not mentioned the fact that there's a prohibition of militarizing space, and this would be a direct conflict with that. So it's very hard to see how these matters would be handled. Creating a space force is a long way from dealing with the issues that you rightly pointed out, which is how do you control this? Who's going to dominate it? Is it going to simply be the U.S. because they spend more money on military and have the means to do this? Or will it be shared? Will it be according to convention? Or is the U.S. going to simply ignore all conventions, simply as they've done with Iran and other issues?
Well, maybe Oliver McGee could answer some of these questions.
Well, I think this is really about science and technology policy. We've been in this business for a long time, going back to Alan Bromley, into Jack Gibbons, into Neil Lane, and now the current science advisor. This focus to science advice to the president is about advancing science and technology in space. And this is where you begin to use really supreme assets of development in space technologies. You're looking at infotech, biotech, wireless tech, microtech, nanotech, cognotech, even looking at elder tech, because we're really looking at not only transportation as business communications, but also space as economic communications. And so really, this is really about how does the United States maintain its supremacy in developing science and technology, and also science and technology policy going into tying it to national security policy and economic policy. This is really consistent to what the United States wants to do. And it's important that the president has now named his new science advisor to be able to help coordinate this science and technology development.
But Oliver, may I interrupt you 1 minute?
Yes.
Vice President Mike Pence, in his speech, said very clearly the plan is to create an elite group of war fighters specializing in the domain of space, a sort of special operations forces, but from above. That does not sound like science and technology.
Well, warfighting has always been about the science and technology development. The country that has the highest amount of science and technology assets is the one that wins the war. Ultimately, the most science and technology that we see pervasive in this president's budget is through the Pentagon. But also NASA is involved, so is the Department of Transportation, because I wrote the National R&D Strategy Plan when I was in the Clinton administration that involved looking at science and technology development at NASA, FAA, the Department of Defense. And so these are the big chunks of the budget, along with the Department of Energy, where science and technology is developed. This is very good for science and technology development in the scientific and educational community in the United States, but we also are interested in trying to make sure that we also take care of what we need to do in developing the new frontiers of where we have to do national security protections.
Okay.
And really, when you look at the United States, it's about protecting its assets, its military assets, but also its space assets.
What an incredible load of twaddle. I can't believe that you're actually going along and saying these types of things.
No. I disagree. I think it's
absolutely incredible that you would be saying that this is about technology when you're clearly, the Vice President has said this is about warfare.
But Einar,
it's nonsense.
Einar, may I just...
I have to disagree with that, because I'm talking about national science and technology development, and to be able to come in and say something like that.
You're trying to eat up time defending something that's defenseless.
Okay, but Einar...
Talking about this.
May I interject? Einar, at the same time, the head of the Chinese lunar exploration program compared China's space ambition to those in the South China Sea. And to be fair, China controls 90% of that sea, or somewhere along that number. So, I mean, that rhetoric is coming out from both countries, isn't it?
Well, when one country expands, another one does too. I don't think that either side is necessarily going to win this. What you have in the South China Seas is a little bit different than what you have out in space. South China Seas goes back, if you go to study the history of UNCLOS, the whole idea of creating something beyond the cannon shot rule, beyond 3 miles, was introduced by the U.S., but later on, the U.S. declined to enter into UNCLOS. It was not a signatory to it. But this caused a land grab, literally in the seas. In space, if you want this same kind of chaos reigning, creating new norms that you have based on military might rather than sitting down at the UN or some adjacent body, where you can sit down and create policies about how space should be used and shared. As it was pointed out, in 1967, they signed a treaty. Things have been quiet since then. Yes, technology has moved on, but I don't think that adding $8 billion to an already overburdened budget, increasing the government, is necessarily going to help the civilian use of technology. It might be that, it's very favorable to NASA to have an additional funding route, but this is not about technology. This is about warfare. It's about throwing another white rabbit out into the world that people are supposed to chase around. There's just nothing can be said except what the vice president said himself, and that this is about creating armed warriors in space, contrary to the conventions.